It's time to discuss NFL Week 5, all the exciting happenings, some of the disappointments, and much more. That's what we're talking about on today's RotoViz Overtime. We had lots of high-scoring games again this week. Shawn, the biggest thing I've been enthusiastic about or positive about through these opening 5 weeks. Week 1 was a little touch and go, but week 2 through week 5, we are getting points put up. We are seeing some offensive innovation come into play. We'll be talking about the Detroit Lions in a moment. I was showing Shawn before we kicked off here one of the plays that we might touch on just briefly when we're going through, but the Lions showing some innovation. We're seeing, Shawn, we don't need to say it anymore. The Miami Dolphins are a very innovative offense. They are innovating, and we have teams like the 49ers who we're going to touch on. They're just getting there. And I guess in that game, they didn't get all their playmakers in positions, but they didn't need to because they ran up the score pretty simple in that one. So looking forward to talking through some of Shawn's thoughts here on today's show. But NFL Week 5, I was joking as well before we started. It's going to be a very good week results-wise for me, but it looks like me and Shawn are going to, or in fact, we have not won this week in our main event team. So that does affect some of my positivity on a Monday morning as I get through the day. But as we record this one, it is starting to get towards the evening time here in Ireland. So Shawn's going to bring all the positivity in today's show to get everything back on track for the rest of the week. But hopefully our listeners, the RotoViz Overtime community, will have had a successful week. Obviously, the first week of buys here in NFL Week 5. There is some players in there too that haven't hit, but we had some monster weeks this week, Shawn. How are you feeling 5 weeks in? Has to be some enthusiasm, excitement there for some of the points on the board.
Yeah, I mean, this was a great week. And as you mentioned, it's disappointing for us to lose our main event. We had Brandon Ayuk, we had Ceedee, and we were going against DJ Moore. You needed those specific outcomes to be slightly different. You had floated the idea of going with Jared Goff. That turned out it would have been the way to go. I was a little bit nervous about not having Amon-Ra and with David Montgomery just seeming to score a touchdown. It wouldn't have put us over. Yeah. But, I mean, I sat there through the whole wave of games. The only real negative thing that happened on Sunday was that as I was watching these games, I was like, oh, I let Colm down by not going with his quarterback suggestion. It did cost us 10 points. We went with Matthew Stafford. He looked good. But Jared Goff, I mean, the Carolina Panthers are not putting up much of a fight on defense. But Sam Laporta, Jared Goff, let's
get into that. 42-24 to the Detroit Lions against the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers now 0-5. They are having some issues. They're working through it with the young quarterback. There's some concerns there. He throws 2 interceptions in this game, and some of those, are very much on him as the quarterback here. But he does throw for 3 touchdowns. Shawn throws 41 times. So there's some positives there, but some concerns very much so with Bryce Young here as we move forward. I have to give a shout out, Shawn, to one of the Carolina Panthers in this one, Adam Thielen. 13 targets going the way of Thielen, 11 for 107 and 1. We mentioned him last week. He's getting there again. DJ Chark gets in the end zone. We're seeing a lot of those veterans over in Carolina be fantasy producers, but Adam Thielen has been a fun player to check up on a weekly basis here over the last couple of weeks. With the Lions, Shawn, are the ones that we want to talk about. You mentioned Goff, very, very efficient. 20 of 28. Well, maybe not that efficient when there's 8 incompletions, but 236 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. Kind of got the job done there, 28-0 up at halftime. They do add an additional 14 points in the fourth quarter. They really cruised through this one, and they're 4-1 now on season. Shawn, they obviously bet the Kansas City Chiefs in Kansas City. They've been a fun story. They had Hard Knocks. There's a lot of kind of publicity has been behind them over the last kind of 2 seasons, but a lot of fun. But Shawn, the big talking point here, we have to say, David Montgomery, I guess, not the big talking point, 109 yards, 1 touchdown, but Sam Laporta, just 4 targets, just 3 receptions, 47 yards and 2 touchdowns. You want more, but in this particular game with the game script that they were in, where they really didn't have to continue to play, this was a fantastic outing from him in a situation where there was no Amon-Ra St. Brown either.
Well, you have to love the fact that they get him a schemed short yardage touchdown.
Loved it.
I mean, many of those have gone to their running back over the last couple of years. And so you definitely, especially if you don't have that goal line back.
I thought you were going to say a couple of weeks, and I was going to. No, it's a couple of years.
Yeah, so you love to see that. But also, he gets involved and scores a touchdown on the trick play. That was one that Jamison Williams touched the ball on. Overall, Williams, not particularly impressive. He gets the 3 targets. 2 of them are underneath. The one that, would have been a little bit more down the field, he does drop. And yet, his speed, you could already see how it was going to affect defenses when they have Amon-Ra back. This team here is not that far behind the Eagles and the 49ers. And for all the talk about the Kansas City Chiefs, the Buffalo Bills, who have the debacle in London, I mean, the 2 clear-cut best teams right now, and obviously I say this as a huge Chiefs fan, and with the Chiefs as the defending Super Bowl champions and 4-1 with their only loss to the Detroit Lions. But right now, Philadelphia and San Francisco are clearly the best teams. I think that you have a tier breakdown from them to the Chiefs, another tier breakdown below the Chiefs to the next best team after that. And yet, or you just argue that the Detroit Lions would be in there, that they would be in that group. So much fun to see Jared Goff playing like this. One of the things that was also important here, if you have him in fantasy, and we have him a lot, we didn't initially have him deployed a lot this week because of some of the matchups, obviously going with Sam Howell against the Chicago Bears defense. You're not going to play him ahead of Tua and that kind of thing. But the rushing touchdown for him as well, there aren't going to be a ton of those, but I mean, that play there really pushes his fantasy day over the top. When you consider that offenses have been more effective over the last 3 weeks, anytime that you have some of these guys that are a little bit lower, they need to be able to compete to keep you in it. If you built your team in that fashion, and certainly if you built your team in that fashion and were able to hit on your early picks, then you almost have an extra guy in there. So someone like a Jared Goff scoring like this, that's extremely encouraging. It's one of the things that we've mentioned in terms of the Geno Smith teams. Obviously, the Seahawks on the bye this week, but we need him to come back and score like that. Again, if you're going to be able to consistently compete with a Josh Allen who plays a terrible game, and yet because he is so incredibly dynamic, is still able to put up a massive fantasy score. And that's a little bit what you're looking for when you make those early QB picks, is that even in games where things don't go well, they can still score points for you. That's not necessarily the case for the lesser players. But one of the things that we have witnessed is CJ Stroud, 4 really good weeks. They lose to the Falcons. You never want to lose to the Falcons, but again, I think that this week's performance from the Jaguars in London demonstrate that last week's performance from the Falcons maybe not as bad as it looked at the time. But that's kind of wrapping back around to this game for Bryce Young, where, yes, he made a bunch of really bad throws and kind of puts his team out of the game. And from a reality perspective, I mean, that's a huge concern for you. It's probably a little bit less of a concern for the Carolina Panthers because they're pointed a little bit more at 2024 anyway. Now, you don't want to come out with a rookie QB and just lose all of these games. It does unsettle your team. It does take a great leadership. I think that Frank Reich is a good coach. I don't know that he's the kind of coach that Dan Campbell is for the Lions, where the Lions had a lot of losses in the early going to the point where he might have been a week or 2 away from getting fired. But the leadership from him, I mean, that team wasn't going to go in the tank. Not everybody can be him. That doesn't mean that you're a bad head coach. It just means that people have different personalities and different things that they bring to the table as the big advantages of having them there as the head coach. I think
there's probably there's a lot of better head coaches in the NFL, but I don't know if there's any better, motivator of men, I guess we'll say. I think that's where Dan Campbell is elite at this role.
I don't know. I mean, there are going to be a couple of
got in big time.
Well, and it seemed like it was even like a caricature of a quote that was a caricature of something else. But his quote about them being the hunted now, but, don't worry, you don't have to come looking for them. You open your door, they're going to be on the doorstep. You're like, well, I mean, is it hard to understand why the players like play for him? So, I mean, that dude is absolutely just fantastic. He gets you fired up when you're sitting there on the couch watching. You're like, whatever you do, if you have a sport that you play that's not football, or you have some like other activity that you like to be involved in, you listen to Dan Campbell, you're like, I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go do it really well for the next 15 minutes or like 5 hours.
One of the things as well, I mentioned the play that we had been discussing before. They are putting even the kind of trick play to Sam Laporta, and we did see a touchdown to George Kittle a couple of hours later in prime time. exact same play that they ran. We see a snap where Jared Goff is under center and they basically snap it between his legs direct to David Montgomery. Just an interesting wrinkle, something that you don't really see. We see direct snaps to running backs quite frequently, but to do it in a different way and then to put that on tape where other teams have to prepare for it, we may never see that play again. We may see it this upcoming week. It's just fun to see the way that offense and that team in general has really bought in. And I think, there is a home road split for this team, but they obviously got to win against the Packers where they all performed. But I think that when this team is at home, they are a fantasy gold mine. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that happens now when we'll see Amon-Ra St. Brown back in the lineup along with Laporta, along with the rest of the guys. And then you add Jameson Williams to that and maybe start to really put some additional pressure on these defenses. So fun times with the Detroit Lions. Shawn, you mentioned
kind of wondered about that 49ers play where they're like, we set up to run this play against the elite Dallas defense all week, and the Lions already ran it. It's like, now they're going to be ready. Like, no, they weren't ready. But Colm, before we move on here, I did want to mention that Bryce Young, the big positive from a fantasy perspective, which is also, a subtle positive from a reality perspective, but one of the things that has been troubling over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that a lot of the teams that are bad and fit in the have-nots category, not only have they been bad, but even in garbage time, they have not been effective and they've not been able to move the ball. And you think of teams like the New York Giants, for example, who can't do anything at any period of time. It's difficult for them to get garbage time value for Darren Waller. You think about the targets they were getting to Wan'Dale Robinson, and yet, they were getting him lit up. It was interesting that he came back into that particular game yesterday. You don't want to be in a situation where the team doesn't function at any point in the game. And Bryce Young put up a lot of points for his guys here. He gets a touchdown to DJ Chark. You mentioned Adam Thielen and the massive points that he's putting up. That to me is maybe the most surprising result of the entire NFL season. It's surprising to see Nico Collins hit on his very highest ceiling outcome. Not as strong a game this week, but on the full season, Nico Collins obviously going to be a massive smash. It's incredible when you see Jamar Chase do what he did. Incredible when you see DJ Moore do what he did. And with DJ Moore, it's perhaps a little more surprising given the passing game there with the Chicago Bears. But those things are exciting, but they're all very believable. What Adam Thielen is doing now, after having really been washed, it blows me away. And it's, a huge congratulations to him because 13 targets. He's open throughout, catches 11 of them. A lot of them are underneath. He doesn't average 10 yards per catch, but it's not like these are, Rondale Moore or Wan'Dale Robinson type of targets either. They're not that. They're getting him the ball down the field. He gets the touchdown at the end of the game. And again, from a fantasy perspective, we don't have these guys, but if you do have some exposure here, you've got to love the fact that in a game that they lose 42-24 and just get absolutely annihilated, that Bryce Young is leading that final drive and throwing a touchdown pass to Adam Thielen, where, maybe you're playing both of them together in a best ball again. Those points are incredibly important to you. So seeing some teams flourish in garbage time, that matters. And then, there's a little bit of that contrast too, where there are some weaknesses to having the rookie QBs and how that's going to play out. But because all of these guys need to get some experience and you need to develop, they're not going to get pulled at the end of the games. Whereas you think about CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, you get blown out like that and you come out. You don't even get garbage time. And so that's a contrast that isn't going to be something that's necessarily consistent throughout the year. But on those occasions when it happens, and this probably won't be the last time. If you're a Dallas fan, you hope it's the last time they get crushed like that. But you're going to have these intermittent eruptions where garbage time really matters to a team like the Carolina Panthers. So from that perspective, Bryce Young, I think you got to be very encouraged.
Moving on now, Shawn, you did touch on it a little bit with the Jacksonville Jaguars. They stayed in London over the last week. They put up 25 points to the 20 off the Buffalo Bills. You mentioned Josh Allen has a pretty strong fantasy day with his 2 touchdowns, 359 yards, and a rushing touchdown to go with that. But this was a tough performance from the Buffalo Bills. They looked all out of sorts throughout, but we do get Big days for Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, 8 for 121 and a touchdown for Diggs. Davis, 6 for 101. He does have a touchdown ruled out in this, and on the very next play, he scores a touchdown, which was an interesting sequence of plays. Which on the big talking points, I guess, coming out of this is going to be the Jacksonville side of things. So Trevor Lawrence passes 315 passing yards in this one, but just the one touchdown. Hasn't really had the heights that people may have hoped he would have, you know, moving into his third season in the league. Wasn't somebody we were actively drafting this year at his ADP, but somebody we liked in terms of his ascension from year 1 to year 2, and hopefully to see the step forward on that. But Travis Etienne in this game, 26 rush attempts, 136 yards, 2 touchdowns. He also has 4 for 48 on 5 targets through the air. Etienne, there's some concerns with how they are, you know, the rushing play calls they are having for him, but it's obviously working out this week. But he has seen a double-digit % target share in 4 of 5 games this season so far. He only done that in 7 of the entire season last year. I think that, you know, there was obviously the concerns with Bigsby coming into the season. They are all, at this particular point in time, evaporated. The other side of it then is Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk. Zay Jones does go out with a knee injury in this one. We are seeing a situation where they both have been, you know, involved in this offense, but it's been a case that it's been pretty even with the edge going towards Kirk if we take that week 1 kind of explosion for Calvin Ridley out of it. But 7 for 122 on 8 targets for Ridley, and we get 6 for 78 for Christian Kirk. No touchdowns for them. The touchdown did go to Zay Jones, who I mentioned did pick up that injury. We'll see how he is moving forward. Question, Shawn, on Etienne. The usage, and we've been so enthusiastic about the usage of the Dolphins and how they have used their running backs. Devin Achane, for example, another huge week, 151 yards for him on 11 carries, 1 touchdown. Looks fantastic, but the way that they tend to use him is to realistically not run him up the center of the offensive line at any point. They are taking him out to the edge on every single occasion, whether that's him coming in a motion, whether that's him coming out of the backfield. We are seeing a lot with Etienne where there's a lot of like wasted plays. It feels like I know we joked about it last week where they're, you know, running directly into a wall at that line of scrimmage, but not as much of getting him on the edge. And it's hard to be critical, I guess, you know, when it is such a huge game for him here. But on those 26 carries, there's a lot of those that, you know, it feels like they're just wasted plays as well. Etienne looked fantastic, though, all around outside of those particular plays. So I guess my questions are your thoughts on Etienne and then rest of season outlook here. Who would you rather have, Christian Kirk or Calvin Ridley?
Etienne is fascinating because he was a guy that we did compare to Jamal Charles, sort of in the same way that we compared Achane to Chris Johnson, where the comparison is saying, I mean, there are
I think it's time now to start comparing Chris Johnson to Achane.
Well, Chris Johnson's historic season, Achane still has a long way to go to get there, but I mean, he's getting there very quickly on a per play basis.
He second in rushing yards in the NFL, Shawn, 37th in attempts.
You feel like that's
Quite
good
efficient.
efficiency? Okay.
It's pretty good efficiency. I think
pretty good.
The any sort of scale that people are using for efficiency is now broke. Just do the results without Etienne in there to get an accurate result.
And so you look at that with Etienne, and obviously he hasn't been the Jamal Charles, and yet it's there, right?
It feels like he could be. What I'm kind of getting at is if they were using him better, he could be. Because
as I was watching this game, due to the way the game is scheduled, right? When you have all of these fantasy responsibilities on Sunday morning before the first wave of games, you're taking care of all of that and, you know, kind of tracking that game in the background. So I see all the numbers pop up and I'm really excited because Etienne is on a variety of our key teams. He's on our team. He's on the Chasing Stolen Bananas team I have with Ben and Pat and Pete. Obviously, as someone we've been heavily promoting, he's also heavily on the teams. So you're excited about that. And then I go to watch the game later once the first wave has started. And I'm like, okay, well, First of all, in that 2-minute drive before the half, they're getting him the ball in the passing game repeatedly. You're like, oh yeah, that's better. He doesn't have to run into the line for that. Also, that's a lot of fantasy points. Let's do that more often. It shouldn't just be the 2-minute drive at the end of the half. But you watch him and they do slam him into the line over and over and over. And it's not a great situation either in terms of some of the short yardage elements. There is sort of a key carry in this game where they bring Tank Bigsby in for the short yardage, and you're like, yeah, I mean, Etienne is not necessarily getting it done. Like, well, also Tank Bigsby doesn't even get back to the line of scrimmage, because they don't have it blocked up, and they have run a very vanilla play where the only way it would work is if your offensive line blows.
I think they were watching. I think they watched the Chicago Bears game from 2 weeks ago against the Broncos and just decided to hand it off into the wall.
So all of those elements are a little bit frustrating. You see that first touchdown run where he actually goes to the edge, and you're like, oh yeah, I mean, no one has the speed to get him to the edge. You see the final touchdown run where he actually does knife through the line on that one. That's kind of what they want him to do. And yet the contrast again between what the Dolphins are doing and what the Jaguars are doing, it does give you some pause, because you're not going to be able to break that long touchdown run every single time. You're not going to always get that perfect 2-minute drill. The 35-point game that Etienne puts up in this, obviously, regardless of how good you are, if you're Christian McCaffrey, I mean, McCaffrey has a good game yesterday against a good defense, and you don't get anywhere near those numbers. You're not going to have that score every time. But there are a lot of games where they don't create the context necessary to get those points out of a back who is one of the 5 best backs in the NFL. And perhaps that was one of the reasons why he was falling in drafts. Anytime that you promote him as much as we promoted him, knowing that the backup is also probably a decent player, you have some nerves about that going into the season. It is good to see that they understand just how good he is, and certainly the 2 touchdown runs in this particular game, along with the flexibility and the intuitiveness that he demonstrated on the receptions. I mean, he's not, as you mentioned, in any danger of losing touches to Bigsby, although, I mean, you could certainly argue that they don't want him to have 30 touches in a game that often. He has 30 touches in this one. I mean, Colm, this is an interesting game because the Jaguars dominated from the initial kickoff all the way to the end. And yet there were a handful of plays in this game where if they simply execute those, they win by 3 touchdowns. This is a game where Trevor Lawrence takes 5 sacks. It's a game where he fumbles 3 times, losing 2 of them, and in both of those really changed the dynamic because of where the ball was on the field. This could have been
another thing I did
Jaguars
like
blowout.
When you're mentioning them jumping out at the start, one other thing that I did like was they get that opening touchdown in the first quarter. They go for 2 points on that first. So it's 11-0 at the end of the first quarter. Just thought it was interesting. Sometimes we see teams going for, later in the game as they try and catch up. I think the Jaguars maybe come out here and thought that maybe they're going to have to put up a lot of points. They didn't have to put up as much points then to beat the Buffalo Bills, but I thought that was interesting starting off the game, because I was kind of wondering then, is there an issue with the kicker? And then they kick a field goal before the end of that quarter, so it wasn't that situation. But yeah, interesting performance by the Jaguars. Hopefully we continue to see the use of Etienne. You mentioned the 26 carries. I don't think we want we'll add in a couple of extra targets, take away 7 of those carries. I think would be a much better use. One game, Shawn, where there was a lot of ugly situations was the New Orleans Saints, New England Patriots. The Patriots now 1-4, 34-0. Nothing happens here for the Patriots. Mac Jones is pulled out. I think it's fair to say that as a benching, he was 12 of 22 at the time. Bailey Zappi comes in 3 of 9. Things did not improve, Shawn, at that particular point in the game. We do see Alvin Kamara, though, heavily featured as the running back, but we do also see Kendry Miller in there. 22 carries for Kamara, 12 for Miller, but 80 yards and a touchdown going the way of Kamara. We do get Miller as well, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 56 yards for him. Was concerns around Chris Olave heading into this game with an ankle injury before the game. He just has the 5 targets with 2 for 12, but he does get in the end zone to kind of salvage that day a little bit. Nothing here, Shawn, from the Patriots, and the carries are split between Stevenson and Elliott, 8 and 8, but it's 24 and 21 rushing attempts, and things are looking drastically bad. I know we talked a little bit about a trade I did for Stevenson on the last show of last week, but things need to turn around here pretty quick for the New England Patriots. It's been a a really ugly start to the season. But Shawn, ugly starts to the season, it hasn't been that for the Dallas Cowboys. They are 3-2, but it's hard to know who the real Dallas Cowboys are. They're a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde team with their performances this season so far. They kind of tend to be either getting blown out or blowing a team out. This week they were in the blowing out variety. 42 points to 10. They lose this one. Dak had a lot of struggles in this. He has 3 interceptions. We don't really see anything going the way on offense from any of the skill position players. So Prescott has not looked good so far this season, in my opinion. But somebody who has looked really good, and the question I have coming out of this is, how good is Brock Purdy? Just like in terms of, you mentioned the rankings, power rankings, kind of for where teams would be in terms of the NFL from a team perspective. Brock Purdy has, since he came into this team, just done everything he can possibly do to look great. I'm seeing quotes here from Dan Orlovsky on Twitter before we start recording, that if Mac Jones was in San Francisco, he would be playing like Brock Purdy. So we just touched on Mac Jones and how things went yesterday for him. But Brock Purdy in this particular contest, very, very efficient game, 252 yards, just throws it 24 times, 4 touchdowns. 3 of those going to George Kittle, who just has 3 receptions for 67 yards and the 3 touchdowns. I guess a quieter offensive day as a whole for all the skill position players for San Francisco as well, because so much of the touchdown production goes the way of Kittle, but they just rout the Cowboys here. A comfortable win there, now 5-0 on the season. Is Brock Purdy a game manager, or is Brock Purdy an exceptionally high-level quarterback? Loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those where you have to give credit to everybody involved. And the contrast between what the 49ers have done and what the Patriots have done recently is so immense. And so with Mac Jones, you're dealing with different coordinators. You're dealing with the fact that it's mind-boggling to think that an NFL team could go out there and believe that Juju Smith-Schuster and Devontae Parker, because they extended Devontae Parker, right? They just signed Juju to a contract that was similar to the one that Jakobi Meyers signed leaving. It's like, if you can't self-evaluate to the point where you understand that Jakobi Meyers is an above-average player and that Juju Smith-Schuster is completely done in the NFL. I mean, this is another game where he draws 4 targets, gains 6 yards. Number one, when you get blown out like this, your starting receivers in Devontae Parker and Juju Smith-Schuster have to be able to draw more than 8 targets between them. But they also have to gain more than 26 yards off of that. It's one of these things where,
Shawn, when we're on about just production, the New Orleans Saints have 319 total yards in this game. They do have one defensive touchdown, but they put up 34 points. Usually we talk about the Patriots, having a defense that's capable of doing stuff as well, but that was also non-existent here today or yesterday.
And I mean, we're getting enough production from Michael Thomas, and in most of the cases where we've seen Michael Thomas gain some value in 2023, it was that little stretch when Jameis Winston comes in. So you have a different quarterback, and it's interesting when you get the different quarterback, if that second quarterback is vaguely competent, to watch how often the target percentages and target preferences shift subtly, and sometimes not very subtly, right? But then you also have this game, as you mentioned, Olave being a little bit limited. When you have a QB, and we've always liked Derek Carr, but it has just become very clear how limited he is. Now, again, he's playing with a bit of an injury. He's playing against a New England team that stuffs the run well. And one of the things in this game is that you mentioned the total yardage. Obviously, you're not going to run well against the Patriots. That's really the only thing they do at this point, is they stop you from running. And yet you still get 34 carries for Kamara and Kendrick Miller together. The only reason that's not massively suboptimal is because you're winning the game so easily, right? And you're just like, yeah, let's suck time out of this game. We get to the end. We try not to get people hurt. I am concerned about Olave, though. As good as he has looked as a reality player, there now are some contextual things in there that are bad for him. But you go back to the Patriots, and it's a huge problem when a guy like Kendrick Bourne, who has not been a coach's favorite with the Patriots, is so far and away your best receiver. How is an NFL quarterback going to have any chance of success in that environment? One of the things that happens, obviously, Bailey Zappi comes in and plays poorly as well. I do think that when you look at the ability of Mac Jones to read the defense and get rid of the ball quickly, that it's not that dissimilar to what we're seeing from Brock Purdy. So if someone who is a former NFL quarterback, even if he wasn't a particularly good one himself, and someone who works at evaluating quarterback tape is saying that Mac Jones would be similar to Brock Purdy, one of the things that you go back and look at there is that right up until they made a weird switch at the end and drafted a bust and then backed into Brock Purdy. I mean, Mac Jones was the quarterback that the 49ers wanted to run this offense. And you certainly think that he would be successful in the same way that Brock Purdy and Jimmy Garoppolo are successful. The question is to what degree? And right now we're seeing a team with Brock Purdy that is successful to a degree that the Jimmy Garoppolo version was not. But part of that is you have Christian McCaffrey, whereas those other guys didn't have that for meaningful stretches. And I mean, McCaffrey is just such a complete and total difference maker. And it's been interesting to watch this team develop. I don't think it's a huge surprise, but it is, certainly a sigh of relief type of moment for anybody who's drafting McCaffrey, who has McCaffrey in Dynasty, because the early going for this team has demonstrated that it's going to be McCaffrey and then everything else off of that. And so the person that you can probably count on week in and week out, and again, not that you're going to have 0 down performances, but you're going to get the McCaffrey points, and then the receivers are going to sort of orbit that. So you have Brandon Ayuk, who's almost unstoppable. I mean, he's getting open deep in this game right from the start. The Dallas Cowboys basically can't even cover him. He was only 4 for 58, but he also did have a long reception that was called back on a penalty. Anybody who lost a very close game obviously rue what happened there. But you get Debo with 55 yards on only the 3 targets. He's involved with 5 carries in this one. And George Kittle had been someone who had been a frustrating player. And yet when we talked about guys bouncing back, Darren Waller versus George Kittle, even though Waller had been more expensive in the last month in redraft, the huge difference here is simply that maybe they're both going to be tricky from a start-sit decision in pure redraft. Obviously, in best ball, the fact that George Kittle has these games in him is huge. And unless you have someone like a Travis Kelce or arguably now maybe even a Sam Laporta, everybody else at the tight end position is going to be these episodic blow-up games. You've got to kind of take the zeros or the low scores with these huge scores. That will do it for you as long as you have the overall team built around them. And even in this game, it's just the 4 targets that he gets the 3 touchdowns on. I mean, one of the things that you needed in this game, if you were playing the 49ers skill position players, is you needed Dallas to come and show up at all. Because, again, I mean, you get both sides basically pulling their players. You get Jordan Mason going 10-69 and a touchdown in this one. And the way that you get that is because Dallas was not competitive. And I'm certainly not saying that Dallas is a bad team. There are a lot of teams that are a lot worse. They do have a very good defense. I think that Mike McCarthy has strengths and weaknesses as a play caller. I think that Dak Prescott has strengths and weaknesses as a quarterback. I continue to be somewhat surprised by the enthusiasm for him in the dynasty and the fantasy communities because he really is very limited. And even with CeeDee Lamb and Tony Pollard, you're not getting the types of consistently elite performances that you would expect to get. And you look at their schedule so far where they beat the Giants 40-0. The Giants are apocalyptically bad. They beat the Jets 30-10 in Zach Wilson's first start. I mean, Zach Wilson and the Jets are bad enough on offense. And certainly in that first game where, I mean, Zach Wilson, fortunately, has made a tiny little progression as we've gone through this month. He's still poor, but that progression has been meaningful. In that game, he was one of the worst quarterbacks ever. Those 2 games don't tell you that much. Then they more or less get, not dominated, but there was no way in which their loss to the Cardinals was fluky. They were outplayed in that game. Then you win 38-3 against the Patriots, which increasingly becomes something where it's just like with the New York Giants. That doesn't tell you anything about the Dallas Cowboys other than they're not a train wreck like those teams. You come in here, it's like, what's wrong with the Dallas Cowboys? They lose 42-10 in a game that's never competitive, but it's like they are not in the same category as the San Francisco 49ers. This game never projected to be close. You go and play at San Francisco. If you don't play a perfect game, you're going to get annihilated. And this offense that they've gone to, where they're getting rid of the ball quickly, they're throwing underneath. Not only is it neutralizing the strengths that CeeDee Lamb could bring to the table, but it brings the entire defense down on top of you, and suddenly Tony Pollard doesn't have any room to run. So the things that Mike McCarthy said in the offseason about how he was going to help his defense, how the offense was going to be more balanced, all of those types of things are exactly the opposite direction of the way the NFL is evolving. And it's certainly not news to anybody that that's the case. Many, many people have been saying that throughout the entire offseason, throughout the first month. That was the concern with Mike McCarthy taking over as the play caller. But in the games against competitive teams, to see it play out so definitive. One of the things that's been disappointing, it's easy for those of us who have a lot of CeeDee Lamb to be frustrated by the fact that they can't get him involved. And it was really an embarrassing performance from that perspective with the Prescott to Lamb. You can't go out in this Sunday night game and have a player like CeeDee Lamb and not get him involved. I mean, this was similar to watching the first month of the Bengals.
Well, you can't have a game.
I don't even know if they know that they have that guy on their team.
You can't have a game.
Does CeeDee Lamb need to go after the game and be like, I'm open every play?
But you can't have CeeDee Lamb in a game script like this and target him 5 times where he has 4 receptions for 49 yards. Like, we talked, I don't know if it was off air or on air, and I was saying, maybe this is like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I'm like, he needs to get at least 10 targets every single game, no matter what the game script. And you're in a situation like this where it's, you know, it's just not getting done. The other part of it is, you know, Robert Woods gets 4 targets, or Brandon Cook, gets 4 targets, 1 reception for 7 yards. It just was and maybe it was just they got shellacked by the 49ers. We'll see next week. But yeah, not a good showing here by the...
Do they have time to get targets to CeeDee Lamb if they're throwing up punts to Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup?
I still think
there's a difference. So you're going to repeatedly throw 4-yard passes and then mix in some punt passes. Like, let's run a real offense.
Yeah, well, maybe that's the main thing. Let's run a real offense. Moving on to the Chiefs and the Vikings. This one, Shawn, got a little bit close at the end where it really feels like, you know, the flag at the end where there's going to be a penalty basically at the goal line for the Vikings that may have extended this game to overtime. That doesn't happen. We get Travis Kelce missing some time in this with an ankle injury. He does have 10 receptions, though, in this particular game, 67 yards and a touchdown. The touchdown coming after that ankle injury. The interesting part here, Shawn, is with Rashee Rice and how he's getting acclimatized into this particular offense. 5 targets for 4 receptions, 33 yards, does get in the end zone with a touchdown. But he has just run 10 routes in this particular game. So getting targeted a lot on the yards or targets per route run basis, being pretty efficient with those. Looks like he should be moving in here to be the lead wide receiver in this offense, but it is hugely spread around the 31 completions, you know, spread heavily throughout the entire roster. Nobody with more than 5 receptions outside of one Travis Kelce, who I mentioned already. Pacheco gets in the end zone again. We do get a pretty banged up TJ Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson in this performance, and both of those kept very, very quiet in this one. The standout performer for the Minnesota Vikings being Jordan Addison. He gets 6 for 64 and a touchdown. Shawn, Kirk Cousins put up numbers to start the season. He continues to put up pretty, you know, good fantasy numbers. He has a wide open KJ Osborne in the end zone here for a touchdown that he fails to complete, throws it about 2 yards behind him. We've talked about this for a long time. Kirk Cousins is okay, but he is holding this team back, in my opinion. They are now 1-4 on the season. They're in a pretty bad situation based on what we talked about already with the Lions. They really have no shot at trying to win this division. What were some of your key takeaways for either side? I'm not going to line you up. You can go which way you want on this game.
Yeah, this was sort of the nightmare performance for Alexander Madison managers, where he gets the receiving touchdown. That was a very well-designed play. And to have that flexibility from the big back is important. So that's the thesis in terms of having him there. But we saw in this game that he loses 5 of the 13 true running back touches, the true carries here to Cam Akers. And this is a team that's going to be trailing in a decent amount of games. We watched them try and establish the run and blow a game, I believe, last week because of that. And this game, they come out and throw. That part of it isn't extremely successful. One of the things here is that even though you're at home, the Kansas City Chiefs are not one of these big playmaking defenses necessarily, but they are tough to move the ball on consistently, to have efficiency with. They slowed down the Vikings running game. Kirk Cousins, even though he doesn't make big mistakes in this one, he doesn't have a pick. 3 sacks is, not ideal, but it's not disastrous like we see from some of the young QBs, but only 6 yards per attempt when you have the players that he's working with. That part is tough. Now, Justin Jefferson, not really available for him in the key moments in this game, so that's going to slow you down. I think in a lot of ways it's impressive that he holds them close with Kansas City when you consider some of the people they were missing. Jordan Addison has another little mini breakout. He's certainly looking like a guy who may not emerge as a star. Obviously, he's a smaller player and not incredibly fast, but in terms of a very viable, above average starting wide receiver, which as a number 2, when you have Justin Jefferson and when you have, probably an elite tight end in TJ Hawkinson, this offense projects to still be very dynamic. Kirk Cousins projects to score a lot of points. They're 1-4. They're in deep trouble. And yet if this Vikings team went on a run where, they had a little more favorable luck like they did last year, obviously, and then you win some shootouts, I guess I wouldn't put the nail in their coffin by any stretch. They just have too much interesting talent there. The flip side of the ball, you look at the Kansas City Chiefs, and Patrick Mahomes can't average 7 yards per attempt against the Vikings. That part a little bit rough. Obviously, he does what he needs to do. They move the ball consistently. You get, as you mentioned, that score from Isaiah Pacheco. He was not nearly as dynamic in this one, but does fine again from a fantasy perspective. This split for the receivers is absolutely infuriating because Rashee Rice is so far and away their most dynamic receiver. Now, the question is, what's this balance between having your offense be complicated and difficult to stop and an offense where you can bring these guys in, incorporate them, and play them? It's still a situation where Kadarius Toney doesn't play that much. Now, part of that's probably on him since he's only available for a handful of plays per game, that kind of thing. They were making the excuse for Sky Moore. It's going to be a slow build. He obviously is doing nothing again in year 2. But Colm, Bjorn and Yang Barnett and I were having a conversation about this pregame, whether or not we start Rice or that last spot. How are you going to address it? We did the Dynasty Startup FFPC RB Triflex right before the year began. And that team, despite punting year 1, is going to move to 4-1. And so again, it's not that you're counting on that or guaranteeing that with some of the perpetual reloading moves right from the beginning. But one of the things that we always mention is don't assume that you're going to lose. And that team hasn't. Anyway, in the battle to try and get to 4-1, we're trying to figure out the final start. And we're discussing the fact that in week 3 and week 4, he runs 48% of the routes basically in each game. And, kind of trying to go through the nuance of it where week 3, maybe he plays a little bit more because of the blowout. Week 4, a more competitive game, and he stays there, and he's closer to the top guys. But the problem in week 4 is that the players who actually ran a bunch of routes for the Chiefs, number 1, none of them were very high. Travis Kelce was way ahead of everybody else. But the guys who were ahead of him were like MVS and Justin Watson. You're thinking, well, that's, again, so weird because the people you would think you'd have to get in front of would be Kadarius Toney and Sky Moore. Now, they're not playing well, so that part of it maybe, again, not a huge surprise. In this game, we get maybe the biggest catch of the game does come from Justin Watson, a 33-yard play where he goes over the back of the receiver. It was one of these kind of punt passes that we were just joking about with the Cowboys. Well, that play looks a lot better when your receiver goes up and makes the reception as opposed to allowing a pick. He makes that play. He's athletic. You can understand why he's in there. It's harder to understand why MVS is in there. 2 targets for 1 catch, 12 yards. But in this game, every time, I mean, if you're hugely invested, as we are in both best ball and on these high stakes teams, the Chiefs will roll out. You'll look through the formation. You're like, okay, I'm going to pick out Rashee Rice. I'm going to watch how he runs his route, see if he seems like he's doing it correctly, see if he's kind of the first read of Patrick Mahomes. And they're like, okay, well, he's not in on this play. So then you do it again the next play. Not in on this play. Next play, not in. Why is he not in the game? The funny thing, and yet the thing that's also like vaguely encouraging, we talked about in week 3, he was tackled on the 6-inch line on 2 different possessions. In this game, it seemed like most of his actual involvement was in the red zone. And so, I mean, if you're going to get a guy anywhere, you might as well have it down there. Either the play before or 2 plays before his touchdown, he was also the target, and he appeared to be uncertain for a split second, broke off, and then continued to run. The target goes to where he would have been if he had just continued running. That kind of freaks you out if the player isn't playing anyway, because you're like, well, now he's going to get pulled and Patrick Mahomes isn't going to trust him. If that's the read, he's not going to throw it because this guy just did something that, like, that's the reason you're not in, because you do things like that. You're not where the ball is. Then he scores and it looks really good. It wasn't an easy play. So you're like, okay, well, he's now overcome it. And maybe like he'll be in on the subsequent drive. You're like, nope, it's back to the scrubs. So huge positives. A lot of concern and consternation about how the Chiefs are deploying these pieces. It's easy to say, well, they've made all these AFC championship games. They've won a couple of Super Bowls. They had the best quarterback. They had the best, or, you know, one of the 2 or 3 best head coaches. Don't panic. Things are going to be fine. And yet you look at their entire group of weapons, and this is a game where Travis Kelce has the 11 targets, but I mean, there's no explosiveness to how he's being used currently. There's a little bit of a reason to panic, right? You look at what the Chiefs are, and then you contrast that with the Dolphins and the Bills and the 49ers and the Eagles, where especially the Dolphins, the Eagles, and the 49ers, how aggressively they've gone after weapons. And how, I mean, this is a game here with the Eagles where Devontae Smith basically doesn't do anything, and yet, like, where was the chance for him to do anything? If A.J. Brown is going to destroy the defense at will, if Dallas Goedert's going to have his breakout game, and he's in a very similar situation there, obviously, to George Kittle. If DeAndre Swift is running through the defense like it's not even there, you're going to have some of those games. The Chiefs are not a team that has an embarrassment of weapons. In any particular game, you're like, well, do they have guys who can start? Do they have guys who can walk out on the field? When you're starting teams with 4 Pro Bowlers, like the other great teams, and then the Chiefs are starting Travis Kelce and then guys they don't even want to put out there, obviously, I mean, that is an issue. I would also note that even though he had a bad drop, Justin Ross a little bit more involved in this game. If you had to drop him to pick up other people in Dynasty, but then a guy got hurt or a guy's going to be on the bye that you were only picked up because of last week's buys, don't be afraid to pick him back up. I don't think we've seen anything yet when it comes to Justin Ross.
So we'll see what happens with the Chiefs if they do settle on a wide receiver, you know, particularly Rashee Rice, and get him to be the wide receiver 1. But it does feel like they're doing, you know, they're getting these wins, a lot of it down to, you know, Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. But, you know, obviously then you have Andy Reid, one of the best coaches in the entire league. I think they could do a little bit better with player recruitment, I think, moving forward to help out those guys on the field, or maybe even getting the guys ready to play. But we'll see what happens over the rest of the season. That is going to do it for this Week 5 reaction show. Monday Night Football coming up, obviously, Packers and the Raiders. Sounds like Devontae Adams is going to be back for that one, so he'll face off against his former team. I'm hoping the Packers can edge out a win on this one, so go Pack go. But
what's your prediction for tonight's game, Colm? And what are you looking for? Would you like to see Devontae Adams shut down? Or would you like it be a situation where he goes for 150 and 2, but Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, maybe even Jaden Reed, maybe even Luke Musgrave, like definitively show that they're the future of the Green Bay Packers, and you win 42-24. You get the reunion, but you also make a statement.
I don't think it's going to be 42-24, Shawn. I think it might be like a 27-24 sort of a game. I think it'll be pretty close, within a touchdown either way. And I would like to see, obviously, the Packers win. The one thing I would like to see for the Packers this week, you mentioned the 2 young wide receivers and the young tight end. I would like to see more completions rather than, you know, I'd like to see a higher completion percentage for Jordan Love, whether that is miscommunications, whether that's, you know, bad throws, whichever it tends to be. I would like to see a team performance where first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, they're closer in the game, are performing well, rather than what we've seen a lot of the time is multiple quarters of just terrible performance and then like 2 quarters or 1 quarter where you're like, this is a lot of fun when this is happening. Can we do this for the whole game? So that's what I'm hoping. You said about Davante Adams, Shawn. I don't care what Adams does as long as the Packers win. And I also do think that he likely has a pretty good game here as well, because he is one of the best wide receivers of the last 10 years. So we'll see what happens. I think there's part of it that he wants to be out there as well, just for the, to play his former team. And I mean that in a positive way, not like in a holding a grudge way. I think it ended not on perfect terms, but I think there's a huge amount of respect from both sides.
Colm, the team that we drafted with King Cap is currently in 4th place, despite Cooper Kupp not playing for the first month, despite Christian Watson more or less not playing for the first month. Pretty exciting to be in that position with those guys coming back. You're already kind of thinking ahead to perhaps we can get this team through and we'll have guys on it that aren't heavily represented. Now, I mean, if Cooper Kupp plays as well as he possibly can, then he's certainly not going to have a 0 advance rate, because you can pull those teams back quickly. Is Christian Watson going to be a guy who starts doing for that team what we need to jump from 4 to 2 or 1? Is he going to be a guy who starts putting up 121 performances? Or, I mean, is there some concern that there's a Kadarius Toney element here? Not maybe that, I mean, there seem like there are some personality things with Toney that previous coaching staffs have soured on beyond just the lack of availability. But I mean, right now, Christian Watson, if you're a Packers fan, you really want him to be healthy a little bit. It's getting a little scary in terms of not being able to have some of those soft tissues work. Do you think tonight is a night where he can kind of put a stamp on the game?
You're setting me up here to be very negative about the team.
No, you're supposed to come out and say, yeah, he's going to blow up.
I think there's a chance that he does. I do think it's a 1A and a 1B. I don't think there's a wide receiver 1 and a wide receiver 2 with him and Dobbs. And at the moment, I think that the team probably trusts Dobbs more than they trust him, both for availability and for consistency. And I think the high-end upside is still with Watson, but the most consistent producer is going to be with Dobbs. So I think both of those guys are capable on a weekly basis of, let's look at it maybe a little bit like what we're seeing with the Jaguars. And although it's not amazing, we're seeing Ridley and Kirk put up very, decent fantasy numbers with the possibility of having bigger weeks. I think, a lot of their games, I think, are going to be in that, I would say 14 to 26. This is a wide range of outcomes, Shawn, 14 to 26 points, and I think it'll alternate on various weeks. I think they're very usable, but there will be inconsistencies, and you would expect that too with second-year players.
Well, I'm excited for the game tonight. Big game, as you mentioned, for the Packers. If the Raiders are going to take a little step at some point, they need to get going. So looking forward to that. Good luck to all of the listeners. If you need points in that game to get you over the hump in week 5, good luck tonight. We're rooting for you. Colm, this was the best week yet. Our team didn't win, but a lot of teams.
Imagine how good of a week it would have been if our team also won. Pretty good week, though, even without that. So hopefully it's been a good week for people listening in. If you want to sign up over at RotoViz.com, you can use that promo code RVRadio2023 to get yourself a 10% discount of a RotoViz NFL pass, get you access to all of the tools and content up on the website. Good luck, as Shawn mentioned, in Monday Night Football. If you do need that, we will be back with our Wednesday edition of the show, so make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime, and my co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.